Well, I would like to welcome you officially to Beyond Belief, and thank you so much for being here today. I've been really enjoying your book, which is very new for me. Although I have an interest in, Vedic matters, I don't have a lot of experience with it, and it was fascinating to see some of the convergences and divergences from some of the things that I'm more familiar with. But I wanted to open up and just ask you, you entitled the book, The Matter of Wonder. What does that mean to you? Why did you call it that? And what's the primary thing that you are trying to communicate to the audience with it?
Okay, so Abhinavagupta uses this word, chamatkara, and literally it means making the sound of like, which is like this expression of sort of like the mind stops. Okay, and so that word has been translated as wonder. Frequently, the word is understood. The word means wonder, and so what I want to convey with this is what he does with this notion of wonder is that he talks about it in terms of it's a transcendence that's not an up and out. It's a transcendence that actually brings us back inward into the materiality of the body. So that's one of the things that wonder for him does. There's and what he does with this as well is that there is an inherent subjectivity within matter and material form. And I think that I think is key, not just for sort of how we can sort of like address our world today, but I think his philosophy around this idea of wonder as a sort of inward sort of evocation of a transcendence is, I think, something that allows us to sort of also do things like bridge get beyond the dilemma of mind and matter. So he does that, and he does that through his concept of wonder, basically.
And I don't even know if I can pronounce his name, but Avinavagupta.
Yeah.
Avinavagupta.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little bit about him just because he's such an interesting character. Abhinava is the first part of his name. Gupta is the last part of his name. It's kind of like the Gupta part is, part of his father was named Gupta, Narasimha Gupta, and so on. But Abhinava is also it means the ever new. And so he's sort of lauded in Indian philosophy. He's basically he's a 10th 11th century philosopher who is understood as coming up with these wonderful novel ideas. Now part of his novel, part of the novelty that he brings us is also related to his forebears, his guru and his guru's guru and his guru's guru's guru, thinkers like Utpaladeva and Somananda. These are sort of other Indian thinkers, all based from the 9th to 11th century in Kashmir. And so Abhinavagupta is basically laying out in magisterial form some of these new ideas of Tantra, and that and the main thing that they offer a way to sort of like I like to think of it sometimes as, I tell this to my students in some of my classes at the university, is that there's that Justin Timberlake song, "I'm Bringing Sexy Back." Well, one of the things Abhinava does is in his thinking, he brings back the body, brings back materiality, and brings back matter in our thinking of what transcendence means.
Okay, right, because you focus a lot on the body and the material aspect of life in the book, and I want to ask you a few questions about that in a minute, but let me ask you this. Why is that important? Certainly mysticism in general, it seems to be looking to transcend the body, and there's all kinds of methodologies to accomplish that, whether it's fasting or chanting or, meditating. It's like how to reduce the influence of the body, which seems to be, ruining your sense of spirituality. Apparently this is different in that it's more of a celebration of the materiality of a human being. But so why is that good for us, doing it that way? And just the second part of the question is this concept of wonder is something that, to me, it seems like it unites the materialists and people who are more oriented towards transcendence. Like everybody seems to believe in wonder. Everyone seems to love wonder. And I find that when I speak to the most hardcore materialist scientists, they also have wonder and they also appreciate it. So I'm just wondering if there's some kind of synthesis available here where, he's pulling together these two threads, in a way that's effective for humanity.
Yeah, no, that's great. These are really, really questions that get right to the heart of the matter. Well, in regard to your first question, this idea of like why isn't transcendence supposed to be about sort of getting out of the body? The body is what actually sort of holds us down and prevents us from getting enlightened. Well, what I think what Abhinav does, I think he's got an incredibly keen eye towards phenomenology, and what he recognizes with this is that you don't really leave the body. We never really leave the body, and so it's bodies all the way down. That's one of the things I argue in the book as well. That Abhinav Gupta talks about this in terms of like even the whole cosmos is the bodies. And he quotes Vedic scriptures to sort of back up his point. So there's this, a very famous hymn from the Vedas. It's still recited today. It's really popular all over India, the Purusha Sukta. And Abhinav Gupta quotes it, and he says, one of the lines in the hymn says, the Purusha, the primordial person, is all this. Everything that became this world, and 3/4 of the Purusha is above in the heavens, and 1/4 remains here. And so what Abhinav says about this is that Purusha makes up the reality that exists here. Now, it is the case that we use the subtle body as a way to sort of like move between these realities, but ultimately, you don't leave the body. Even if you think that you've sort of moved out in a transcendent state, there's still a body there. Now, how does that work? The way that works is it works because you're always here now. Okay, and that's a sort of we have a fundamental kind of subjectivity. There is no awareness that is a genuine awareness that's actually not attached to a sense of I. And I mean, he talks about this as ahanta, the state of I-ness, and that what happens with this is that whenever you have something like I-ness, the sense of I, you've got a body. Okay. I have another article that I think might have only just come out recently, and this you might like this one because it's kind of fun, because what I do in this article is I look at a contemporary physicist named Nicholas Gisin, who goes back to L.E.J. Brouwer's mathematical formulations. These are all from like with when Einstein was debating Bergson over ideas of like time and relativity. And so Brouwer also sort of uses some of what Bergson's talking about in terms of setting up a mathematics, and he calls this branch of mathematics intuitionist mathematics. And a couple of the things that he argues for this mathematics is that contrary to what we think of in mathematics as sort of like a transcendent kind of science of mathematics as a way where you can completely be objective and transcendent, what Brouwer argues is that ultimately, even in mathematics, you're not going to escape the sense of subjectivity. And he brings back in the idea of a subject as well, and that you're going to get different sorts of mathematical outcomes based on the subjectivity of the mathematician. So now you can see that as a kind of like quantum physics interjection, but these are really much deeper sort of forays into philosophy, because they're really upsetting our whole sort of notion of what science is. And that has to do with this idea that is there a quote objective reality? What I like about Abhinav, to bring it back to him, what I like about Abhinav so much is that he understands that the primary reality of all of this is a subjective perspective, and so that has to do with mystical experience, but it also has to do with how we map the world as well.
Mm-hmm.
So, Yeah, so there's one other. I have one other article that I've got. This is also hasn't come out yet, but it'll come out soon. It goes off of an earlier article that I wrote about a contemporary neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi, and
Hmm.
it's this integrated information theory. 3.0. There's soon going to be a 4.0 version. Um, so this is neuroscience, and what Tononi does is he actually sort of also I don't think he recognized this early on, but more recently I think he's actually recognized the move that he made and what it entails, which is to basically he starts with subjectivity, and it goes back to the same idea that we have with Abhinavagupta. So I think what we're seeing here is a kind of shift in the landscape. It's pretty nascent at this point. Not many people are sort of aware of this yet, but I think we're at the vanguard of a shift that's beginning to understand that what's primary is consciousness. It's not
Hmm.
materiality. Okay, but that materiality that makes it the world is itself a kind of consciousness as well. It's consciousness you know, sort of like unfolded into a kind of materiality.
Right. And that is an exciting, for me, that's an exciting development to be watching. And you can certainly see it playing out, out in the scientific world, the debates and the discomforts and, and some people being enticed, and dealing, but people are dealing with it, I think, in a way that they haven't in recent decades. And so to me, that's very encouraging. But so your book deals with the concept of a kind of panentheism from the Middle Ages in India, right? Can you explain, just for the benefit of the audience, what panentheism is, and why this version of it is significant?
Yes. Okay, so panentheism, the word's coined, I think, in the early 20th century. Panentheism literally means the totality, and within theism. Okay, so we've got things like panpsychism, a popular philosophy today, which says that everything that you see around you is conscious. Matter is conscious, the table is conscious, and whatever you see, it's conscious. What panentheism says is that all of reality and matter is, yes, conscious, but there's also a quality of a kind of a capacity for a transcendence to occur as well. So there's basically this idea of divinity, which is both in the world, but also can transcend the world as well. Okay, so now, and Abhinavagupta what's important about his version of panentheism is that he makes a really good case for explaining how it is that okay, so here's the problem. If everything in the world is conscious, why is it that we see a difference between, say, the cup that you just picked up and, say, your dog? Your dog, we think, I mean, maybe, people earlier, like Descartes, I think at one point, said something to the effect that dogs aren't conscious.
Right, right.
But in any case, most of us today, a dog is conscious, okay? But your cup is not conscious. So how do you sort of understand that distinction, which we see, which, we encounter throughout our lives? So Abhinavagupta's panentheism, he uses another term, vimarsha, and this particular term is his way of sort of pointing out how you can have consciousness everywhere and yet still have some things like you or me, maybe our dogs, as conscious, and other things as not conscious. So it's kind of a continuum, a spectrum of consciousness.
Okay. And does panentheism in this regard imply an ultimate oneness or unity to reality, or can you have it, with multiplicity?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, what I love about panentheism is because you kind of get to have your cake and eat it too, because you get both. On the one hand, you do get a sense of oneness, and like the underlying fabric that is that there is just all one reality, this oneness, but you also get multiplicity. And one of the ways that this multiplicity comes through is through the sort of transformation of subjectivity into objectivity. So the self can sort of, the sense of I actually becomes the sense of this. And Abhinav uses this sort of Indian philosophical template of what there is called the tattva system, which is like, a list of all the different things that can possibly exist, and they're ordered. They're hierarchically ordered in terms of that which is the lowest, least sort of capable of expressing consciousness, up to that pure subjectivity. Okay, so it goes from Earth as the lowest, the least, which is not, but Earth is still conscious. It's just what Abhinav says about this is that when you take a clod of earth or your cup, which would be understood to be made of earth, latent, its subjectivity is held within it in a latent form. It's not. But there's this one quote he has in a particular text called the Patricia Vivarana, and in this text he basically says that if you address your this clod of earth, like say your cup, or maybe a statue in a church, if you say, oh, Jesus on the cross, or Mary, Mother of God, and you start talking to that inanimate object made of, earth, this cup, or this sort of like, image within a church, that you can actually wake up its latent consciousness, and then it becomes alive as well, because it's not as though it was ever ontologically separated from consciousness. It's just that it's latent in things that aren't expressing their sense of subjectivity.
So that seems to open up either vistas or a can of worms. I'm not sure which way to describe it. So maybe you could, for my own edification, I think myself and many Westerners tend to look at the religious systems that came out of India as being polytheistic, and hundreds of thousands of deities. At the same time, I've come across sources that seem to say that no, those are all just manifestations of one ultimate thing. Which is it? Can you help us to understand that? And that will lead, I think, into more of these, like the cup that you deal with in the book a lot, the concept of, a clay cup and whether it's conscious or not. I think it's a very important one. I'm going to get at that in a minute. But for right this second, polytheistic or monotheistic?
That's a wonderful question. Okay, so of course it won't be monotheistic. It's polytheistic until it becomes panentheism, in which case it's both polytheism and a kind of not panpsychism, but panentheism. So it's not like polytheism versus monotheism, because monotheism is for these thinkers, and I think they're probably right about this, monotheism is ultimately inadequate to understand a whole lot of different things, not just things like how would God then sort of be able to sort of connect with them, with humans, if God is sort of separate from us, and but also Abhinavagupta's panentheism actually is able to solve the problem of theodicy. And that is that, why would we have a God who's cruel to us if that God is omnipotent and omniscient? So with panentheism, you don't run into that problem. So it's not polytheism versus panentheism. It's versus monotheism. There's never really a monotheism. There's only really a sort of panentheism, which is and not quite a panpsychism, because there is this sort of consciousness that comes from the subjectivity of the absolute, and that absolute becomes polytheism when it sort of allows itself to evolve into this multiplicity of the different, the 3,306 deities that you get in the early Rig Veda. So there's this idea that polytheism is the evolution of this one. Okay, now, but you wouldn't call it monotheism ever, I think. And that's because monotheism means there's one God, but that God is separate from the reality But
Oh, because I don't understand it that way.
okay, yes.
Um,
What do you think about that?
I Monotheism to me is, as I've always thought of it, as co-equal to panentheism,
Okay.
um, meaning, and I'm coming to the realization that it seems like a lot of people equate monotheism with this separateness idea, but the more, I mean, at least I'm coming from more of a Judaic, a Kabbalistic perspective, where a lot of the Vedic ideas seem to be present, in from chakras to panpsychism, the what you were mentioning just before about the earth having consciousness and then moving up like sort of a progression of plant life and animal life and human life, and I know not everyone likes hierarchy, in terms of giving higher consciousness to other various entities, but I think most of us intuitively feel that that's correct. So for whatever it's worth, my understanding of monotheism sounds very similar to this kind of panentheism. But there's a quote in the book, and again I'm gonna butcher the pronunciation, but Somendana.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Samananda. Uh-huh.
yeah. So he said, all entities consist of everything, since everything is of the nature of everything. Everything exists here as everything by having the nature and form of all the various entities. The pot has my nature, and I have that of the pot. Okay, and then you go on to also quote Whitehead, and you say, in a certain sense, or he says, in a certain sense, everything is everywhere at all times. For every location involves an aspect of itself in every other location. Okay, so this is like this grand, inter-inclusion of time and things and objects, and all wrapped up in one thing. So my question for you is, should we treat the pot with the same care and zeal, for instance, as a human being? Who should we prioritize? If a car is speeding down with no brakes down a mountain, and there's a clay pot and there's a human baby, God forbid, I would think that we'd all feel, 99.999% of humanity wouldn't, their compassion for the pot would vanish, I think, So what are the implications of thinking that everything is so inter-included? Like, what does that do to morality? What does it do to our conception of the world?
Yeah, you're just coming with all these really wonderful sort of like honing in on like really the things that matter in terms of how what we think about with some of Abhinav's thought. Okay, I mean, the way that I understand this is that if you bring it back to this idea of subjectivity, I think that is partly how you sort of come up with a practical morality. So that if you're okay, I'm a human, and I like, as a human, I like humans, and so I'm going to prioritize a human always. Now, you could also argue that, well, the pod has a lower sense of consciousness than the human. I don't think that's a good path to take. However, I mean, you could argue that according to the hierarchy, pods are less important than humans. Even if a pod has a latent subjectivity, it's still less important than a human. And so I'm going to prioritize the human. So you can take that route, but you can also take the route, which I think is not a greater route to go on, because then what it always involves is a kind of sort of externalized judgment of someone has to be the one who decides that, that children are more important than pots. Okay. And we all agree on that, but there become other cases, like if you're living in Nazi Germany and you're, and it's like, well, is this person, sort of an Ubermensch versus an Untermensch, whatever. And so those kinds of hierarchies, which are always decided by somebody on the outside, I think are dangerous paths to take. I think that Abhinavagupta's philosophy actually is a better sort of route to take, and that has to do with this idea of subjectivity, and that we as humans expand our awareness, and we tend to expand it first towards other humans in a sense. And so that, so it's not a sort of absolute truth that, that we say that I'm going to save this human because it's absolutely better. It's more that we say, I'm going to save the human instead of the dog because of the fact that, I am a subjective person living here at this moment with my reality, and I'm choosing this. I'm choosing other humans over, say, a dog. Yeah, obviously, no one's going to choose the pot, but
right. Some people would. I think some people would choose the dog, frankly. But but I think that would be a huge debate in society. To say the least. And for me, certainly would raise, big problems. And I have a dog, and I love my dog. But I think I would save probably a human stranger over my beloved dog any day of the week. And maybe that has to do with my subjectivity and the fact that he's furry and he's a mammal, and whatever. It's closer to me, but
yeah.
it raises interesting questions. That's all.
I love the fact that you're I love the fact that you're bringing up exactly these sorts of things. And if you think also about like one of our problems, in our world today has to do with people who lack compassion for other people and for nature as well, and so, I think that's one of our biggest problems, that, people just don't have a capacity to have compassion even for like the bees, that are giving us food, whatever. And so as a result, they'll use certain pesticides, and then bye bees. And that's bad for us ultimately. And then the argument is that, well, it's going to destroy our civilization, but really the bees as well. What Abhinav says about this is that as you sort of like evolve or grow on a spiritual level, the sense of subjectivity actually expands. Okay. Mm-hmm. And that when it expands, what happens is that you're able to incorporate more within yourself. Now, last semester I had this student in my class. She was an older woman in this big class, and she related this sort of story that she had. An experience that she had in a philosophy class where the professors, did the trolley experiment with her and her child, and the other students got annoyed with her because she said, I won't actually sacrifice my child, even if there's 5 people going to die in the trolley car experiment, because I don't know them. And the professor, I guess, berated her, and it kind of left her a little traumatized. From this other philosophical perspective, Abhinava's perspective, it's not like we're saying something is better than another thing. What we're saying is that the minute you start to talk about it in terms of like, oh, you have to make this choice between 5 people and your child, then already you've sort of abandoned this notion of this Abhinava Gupta's idea of a kind of a subjectivity which encompasses the whole. In other words, the trolley problem is basically a false dichotomy. It's not something that ever happens in reality because of the nature of subjectivity and the nature of our sort of how we exist in reality. So all right, so you might be wondering like, well, wait, it could happen. It could happen. How this would work in, say, this philosophy, Abhinava's philosophy, is that so long as your subjectivity is like constrained to a sort of a sense of idanta, the sense of thisness, you can create scenarios like the trolley problem. But if you sort of stay focused within the sense of like this inner subjectivity, like really understand this, then you won't. Now this is going to sound a little mystical, but I think this is where he would go with this.
That's okay.
But then such a situation won't arise. Like you won't be confronted with a trolley problem ever. Your kid, 5 other people, if you rest within a kind of a state of ahanta. And if you think about it in real life, has anybody ever really been confronted with this sort of an actual trolley problem? It's only sort of mad scientists who are trying to sort of like control or destroy this part of the world who then sort of have to make these kinds of decisions, and they've already sort of been separated from a sense of self and connectivity with the rest of the world, if that makes sense. Already separated from those 5 people that they would be killed by the runaway trolley. I know I'm going a little bit fast.
No, that's okay. That's okay. We're touching on important things, but from my edification, let's drill down on that pot for one more second, because which I think plays a central feature in his thinking and in the book. when you boil the pot down to its component parts, right? When we start to talk on the level of atoms, right? The pot is not dissimilar to the air that surrounds it. It's when you go down deep enough, there is no pot. There's this is just science, right? There's some kind of energy that's moving around at some high speed, right? Does that matter? I mean, like, when we start deconstructing objects and people, do we want to say already that we can see from science that everything is the same on some level, and it's just a subjectivity that distinguishes one thing from the other?
Yes, I think that's the crux of it. Again, if you think about this notion that consciousness is primary, okay, so and what is consciousness? Consciousness is fundamentally the sense of ahanta, this I-ness, and that I-ness is what unfolds to become more and more sort of materially oriented and sort of circumscribed by the material sort of basis that makes up the I. So we're humans, we're sort of in the middle here because we have a sense of I, but our sense of I sort of extends mostly to the body. And then sometimes our I will expand to include our child, our parents, our friends, and so we'll have a kind of deep sort of sense of, and sometimes it doesn't even include our sense of the body either,
Right.
So yeah, and when so what Abhinav says about this sense of I-ness is that this whole world for the highest reality, Shiva, what this highest reality understands the entire universe, this whole world, to be its own body. Okay, and so this helps us to understand how to develop a kind of morality as well. Because when you actually get to a place where you understand your connectivity with all of the other things that exist. Now, it is true, to your point that all of this is just energy. But what is that energy? Well, that energy ultimately sort of falls back onto this idea of being a pure subjectivity. It's consciousness and its intentionality that unfolds to become the materiality of what that makes up the world. And so we're here, and now we, this is also, I think, for me, why I find this idea of the subtle body so fascinating, because the subtle body is sort of allows us to sort of, it's a sort of mediator between this, the physicality of the world and the sort of pure subjectivity. So it's a great way for us to sort of like expand the way we think about this, so that we don't have this sort of just this rough dichotomy, that we actually can sort of like, move between this reality of object and subject. And for Abhinavagupta, it's really more about this sort of a modal shift than anything else. It's shifting from the mode of being object, idanta, to the mode of being subject, ahanta, I, versus, materiality. And how big is your I? How big is it? Right now it's your body. You expand it greater and greater extents, and then then that's how there's a certain kind of spiritual expansion. Have you ever read this book by Elaine Scarry called The Body in Pain?
No. Interesting title, though.
She wrote this book some time ago, and it's in two parts. I mean, she doesn't obviously she doesn't talk about any of this kind of stuff, and she doesn't talk about and she's not really particularly spiritual. But what she talks about is, the first part of the book is all about what happens when you torture prisoners, and then when you torture prisoners, one of the things that happens is that their own sense of self becomes narrower and narrower and narrower. And then the second part of the book is all about how you sort of, so that's the world destroying, through this, destroying a person through, pain, and having them become smaller and smaller in their own selves, to the body. And then, and then the second part of the book is all about how you sort of make a world. And that's sort of where the world gets expanded, first yourself, then your family, then your community, then the nature around you. So, obviously she has nothing to do with, this, Abhinavagupta, this, Indian philosophy, Indian religiosity or spirituality. But I think that she's, that the same kind of, modal shift is operative for her work as well. in this one book.
It sounds interesting, and I'm going to check that out, which I haven't heard of it before, so thank you. But I want to see if I can get in 3 more questions in like 8 minutes. So that gives us about like 2 minutes per. I know it's not fair. Each one of these things deserves a long treatment. But there's a quote I really like that you write about in the book about what being a human is about. And you say viral life is considered not alive because it relies on a host to reproduce. It needs another corpus to replicate its own life. Yet, if we think about this, how much of our own body is really us? 90% of the DNA in the human body is foreign, not really human, but other bacterial life, right? So I think a lot of that's disturbing would be disturbing to a lot of people, I think, to consider that, the most fundamental aspect, or maybe not the most, I think their sense of self is the most fundamental, but the second most fundamental, their sense of having a body, the idea that it's not really mine or it's comprised of all these foreign elements it might be profoundly disturbing. So why do you bring that up? Why do you want people to be aware of that? And what does it mean to be human then in your way of thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I talk about this as much in the book, but I have another article that which I call the yogurt model of self, and that is basically that we think of the body as just this thing that we have, and there's an I or a sense of subjectivity in this body. But what's nice about, say, an Indian philosophical perspective, and the idea of the subtle body is that it sort of recognizes that we're not really master in our own house, to quote Freud. It's basically that we can't even control when we get ill. So clearly we're not really master. But the idea here is that the body is made up of a whole host of gods. Now, I like the idea of gods rather than sort of just bacteria, and that's because it allows us to sort of recognize a certain kind of sentient subjectivity for the different parts of ourselves, and that shows up in our own personalities. Like sometimes you're angry, that's a certain kind of subjectivity, and sometimes you're sort of not angry, you're sort of like really mellow, and so what this philosophy does is sort of understands these sort of different modalities of the mind and of the body as being a function of all of these things that we have sort of, in a sense, fermented to make up who we are, our own selves. I don't know. That's a sort of the 2-minute answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. I want to ask you also about teleology, and to quote you one more time. You say I suspect that what makes contemporary new materialism, and new materialism is something that you talk about a lot in the book, a new way of looking at materialism. So what makes a contemporary new materialism panentheism suspiciously with a sidelong gaze is precisely its linkage with telos. The radical import of Darwin's discovery of evolution is just this freedom from a preordained telos given from on high. Okay, yeah. So that makes it sound like teleology is bad, from my reading of it. And I wonder why. What's wrong with it? It's like when something is geared towards a goal, is that necessarily a bad thing? Does that imply hierarchy? Just because if we're subject to the laws of nature, which we are, we're all subject to the force of gravity, for instance, and that it does come from on high in a certain sense. Like, what's wrong with that? Why should we resist that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you on this. I'm sort of saying that in part because that's sort of like in the current sort of zeitgeist of like the academy, there is this idea that you want to sort of like teleology. I mean, teleology is a bad thing, and it starts even also, not just in sort of the humanities, but even in the sciences as well. Clearly there's a sort of psychological driver for 20th century science and the humanities wanting to sort of get rid of notions of teleology. And what's that driver? It's like, well, they don't, 20th century science and the humanities don't want to be sort of controlled by a god. I think right. That's sort of, and even if you say, well, it's not a god in heaven, it's sort of like these rules of like where we're going as a species. it's really boils down to the same thing. And that's why I think it's the sort of the boogeyman in that, in the back room that is trying to be excised by a sort of 20th century atheistic science. I mean, I agree with you ultimately, really. I think that, let's maybe think about, what teleology could mean and how it could mean. I mean, I think I quote Nagel as well, because he also sort of wants to bring teleology back in a sort of more open-ended way, away from the notion of a God. Yeah, what's your take on that?
Mine? I mean, I think that the world seems replete with teleology. It just seems like just as fundamental as anything. It's the material world, or if you believe in consciousness is fundamental. I look at the world personally, and I see goal-oriented activity all over the place. It seems very hard for me to dismiss that.
Yeah.
However, I see all the time there are very grand attempts made, almost and a lot of assumptions made that there is nothing to look at there. So I'm always surprised by it, and just wondered what you thought. But it seems like we're on the same page.
Yeah. Well, the other thing too about I think the other sort of point, the other side of this whole notion of teleology, the other reason why it's bad is not just because of the idea of God, but also because whenever you have teleology, you always have ultimately a subject. A subject who has a certain intention and intentionality towards a certain goal. And I think that the push in the 20th century and 19th century as well is to sort of come up with a science. It's going to be sort of objective and and if you want something objective, you can't have a teleology. That's one other aspect of it. But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
fair enough.
We are on the same.
Last question for now. I saw a lecture that you gave online, which I really enjoyed. And you talk about yogic powers, and which means, that there are wise people called yogis in the Hindu tradition. And they seem to be able to accomplish certain things that most people can't. Let's put it that way. You discuss some of them. You suggest that they can be in two places at one time, cause objects to appear or disappear, tell the future, and bring dead things back to life. You note that these phenomena are presented in the literature with no fanfare, meaning like it's not a big deal. they're just writing about it, and it's fascinating to me because a lot of these phenomena are written about with no fanfare in the Talmud, for instance. The sages do things, and it's certainly considered important. It's like indicative of their high level of spiritual status, but it's not, they don't excessively focus on it. It's just a thing, right? So I'm inclined to be willing to go there, My question for you is, I'm just curious, like, do you personally believe it? Why? And why should a skeptical world take those notions seriously?
Yeah. Okay. I had an experience in India once. I was hanging out with this guru, Karunamai, and she has these powers to sort of, like, I remember sitting it's a group of like maybe 20 Indians, and she was doing this thing where this amrita nectar was coming from her feet, and so a number of these this devotees were really going crazy. They were, gathering around her and, trying to collect this sort of sweet substance coming out of her feet in a bowl. And I was sitting in the back and I had my arms crossed and I was like, in my mind, I was thinking like, why are you doing this? This is so stupid. No one's going to get enlightened from this. So I was sitting there, thinking all of these things, and then she looked up at me with this look of like, what is your problem? And I was like, oh.
Right. Come get nectar.
I'm like, maybe she can read my mind. Better shut up. And yeah. So I mean, I've seen various different gurus in India do this sort of thing. There are numerous gurus, and I've seen some of them do this. So the question is then, what do you make of it? Okay, and so I mean, you could do, my sort of, somewhat skeptical perspective of like, why are you doing this? This is such a waste of time, or you could sort of say like, well, maybe it shows that we're sort of like not limited by our, we're not limited by, what we think of as the laws of physics. If you're a great yogi, you can sort of accomplish all these other sorts of things. So why is it relevant for us to study? I think that, on the one hand, I'm like, maybe it's not relevant. That's my, okay. On the other hand, and that was my response in the moment of that particular, on the other hand, there's a part of me that actually, thinks like, well, it allows us to sort of expand the notion of what it means to be human. If some humans can sort of, it's sort of like, the black swan, or, to go back to William James, one of the things he wanted to do was to sort of like research the sort of the extreme types of events in religiosity so that we can actually really understand it on a deeper level. And I think that when we see things like this, it really does upset the basic paradigm that we have. You can't sort of, at a certain point, you can no longer sort of say, the world is just what we were told, that's what we were told, that's what it is, nothing more. You have to, if you sort of have an open mind, and you're not sort of, if you're not sort of coming from a place of fear and you have an open mind, then you actually have to sort of like, think about and grapple with it. In some cases you may say, oh no, it was sleight of hand, legerdemain. Other cases you might actually sort of, but if you confront something and to the best of your ability, you sort of realize, okay, this is something that doesn't seem possible from my best perspective, then it really does force you to sort of rethink what the nature of reality is.
Mm-hmm.
And that, I think, is its benefit, and it's sort of, you can see that also as, like even, thinking about sort of, subjectivity as primary, sort of, that makes that theory a better theory for understanding our world if you confront these sort of crazy things that some yogis can do.
Yeah, Heather, everyone's discussing this UFO whistleblower story that I'd love to have a whistleblower on psychic phenomena, and we do have, we have the people at DOPS in Virginia who are working on these kinds of things in a very disciplined, scientific way. Yeah. And I think that if these capacities were really revealed and people could train in them and we could expand the entire notion of what it means, like you said, like what it means to be human in such a profound way, I think it would alter society in a very, very significant way. So let's hope that things continue evolving in that direction and that it proves to be viable and useful for everyone. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I really enjoy your work and hope you continue to share it with the world at large, and hope a lot of people watch this and get a lot out of it.
Thanks, Adam. It's really been a pleasure. It's fun talking to you, and thanks for sort of, really honing in on the sort of most important things, I think, as well.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you, everyone watching, and please take a moment to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please visit www.beyondbelief.blog to stay abreast of all that we have going on. Thank you so much for being here. Have a great day.